Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Ethnic Politics. This week we're finishing out a series of discussions on group identity. And in the same spirit as addressing the politics of Black identity last week, we're going to be looking at an equally controversial subject today, and that is the study of whiteness as an ethno-social class. And more specifically, we're going to be looking at how immigrant groups in the United States have achieved the recognition of being white in a country that was founded largely on exclusionary white principles of white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism. So groups like the Irish, the Italians, the Poles, and even increasingly elements within the Latin American community, right? They have all undergone some kind of self-transformation to be included within this ever-expanding community of whiteness. And even though becoming white doesn't necessarily come with economic benefits and privileges, it does come, and here's where the controversy sets in, it does come with being seen as part of a more privileged group of people than others. And if there ever is an other in this country to be differentiated from, it's the African American community. So the book that we are looking at this week, and the one in which we are focusing much of our attention, is this really interesting study by Noah Ignatieff. It was published in 1995 called How the Irish Became White. Right? How the Irish Became White. And if you know anything about Irish immigrant history, right, you know that the Irish sort of bore some of the worst elements of racism, discrimination, institutional harassment among early immigrant communities within the United States. Irish Americans today, they have their narratives, they have their collective memories of stories of their ancestors coming to the United States and immediately being discriminated, spat upon, right? The sign that we just showed here before, the help wanted, no Irish need apply. A sign like this, right, is more of a novelty that was made after the fact, right? There was no sign like this that existed in store windows. However, newspaper ads and individual job postings did have that very same sentence, no Irish need apply. So we see that at least in, let's say, the first half of the 19th century, the Irish were not included as part of white America. And according to these narratives, the Irish had to fight for their struggle to be included within the white communities, but that struggle oftentimes led them to adopt certain policies and beliefs that doesn't so much dispel and discredit nativism and exclusionary nationalism, but buys into it, right? So the idea that the Irish, start out as being some of the more discriminated elements within early American history, only to become some of its most vocal proponents and defenders of that very same exclusionary nationalism and racism, gives one pause to think that in order to become white, you end up having to buy into a system rather than try to dismantle that system. So the questions that we're going to be addressing this week are in many ways no less controversial than those that we posed last week when examining Black identity. The first one is probably the most overarching, right? What does it mean to be white in America? And what does it mean? And you think about this for a moment, especially if you're born here, right? If you're born white, you don't really think about it. You just maybe see it as a skin color, and that's basically it. But is whiteness a race? Is it an ethnicity? More specifically, is to be white in America, does that mean being part of a socioeconomic identity? Does it mean having some socio-political privilege? Let's kind of pause here for a moment and think about this, because, to be white in America, according to many whites, doesn't necessarily come with extra advantages, right? There are lots of poor whites, there are lots of struggling middle-class whites. There are those that, wish that the country was, somehow more sympathetic to their socioeconomic plight. But at the same time, to be white, if it comes with privilege, it's sort of an indirect privilege. And the privilege is that you're not necessarily harassed or discriminated against or given an additional set of obstacles as you would if you were, let's say, black or Latino or Asian or Muslim or others, right? So if there is any kind of privilege of being white in America, it's that there are less problems to deal with than, let's say, other groups might have to face. But that doesn't necessarily mean that being white means that everything is just given to you and that you somehow are part of this dominant ethno-political class within the United States. Second question to address. How have understandings of whiteness changed and developed throughout American history? The one thing that we can kind of see by noting the evolution of previously regarded non-white immigrants, like especially Irish and then later on Italians, is that whiteness can be rather exclusionary at times. And so groups like the Irish, the Italians, later on, let's say the Poles, and as I mentioned, even some communities within the Latin American groups, are not so much trying to dismantle the exclusionary membership of whiteness, but just simply expand what its membership considers. So, is whiteness inclusive, or are there certain groups that will forever be denied membership, right? So it's like, do we convince the guardians of whiteness that, yes, Irish are whites, right? Italians are whites. Certain Hispanics can certainly be white. And, ultimately, is it really just, boiling down to what's the color of your skin? Or is it also a way of thinking? Is it a way of somehow integrating your own citizenship within the country and contributing towards upholding some status quo, some ideals, some form of patriotism, right? So how have understandings of whiteness changed and developed throughout American history? And is it still today, somewhat of an expanded country club, but still one that, checks qualifications and eligibility at the metaphoric door? Third, and this is a real interesting one, why have lower class whites, and as I've mentioned, to an extent Latinos, become some of the most vocal proponents and defenders of whiteness? And if we kind of think of whiteness as the dominant class, those at the top of the economic food chain, there's a lot of poor white people, as I've already mentioned. There are a lot of white communities that are completely and utterly exploited by the current socioeconomic and socio-political system of the United States. So you'd think that they would be, part of the vanguard that is challenging this system of inequality. And yet, some of them are one of the most vocal proponents and defenders of that system. So is whiteness not so much an element of economic success, but a state-sponsored mark of, individual success and accomplishment, right? Is it a position of superiority and domination over other groups? So it doesn't matter what your income is. It doesn't matter what your station is in life. By being white, do you somehow see yourself as better than other groups, marked by skin color, marked by different degrees of ethnicity? Right? So what does it really mean to be white? I think that, the concept of white is way too much of a monolithic identity that many people just sort of take for granted. And depending upon where one is on that socioeconomic ladder, understandings of whiteness have different meanings and connotations. Right? So, what we need to sort of understand here, and this is taken, from Ignatiev's work, is that there is a process on becoming white. And this is something that for many Americans today, seems, nonsensical because it has happened already historically, right? The group that you might identify with has somehow made its way into convincing the then powers that be that they are part of this white community. So becoming white, as I've mentioned, isn't necessarily becoming rich or even achieving the rank of middle class, although that certainly helps. Right? As I've already mentioned, and I'll mention again, there are many poor whites in this country that actively defend the institution of whiteness that supports in itself a system of economic exploitation and domination. So what does it then mean? Well, becoming white, there's a couple of hypotheses here. Becoming white means, first and foremost, being seen as an individual to be judged instead of a group to be condemned. All right, let me repeat that again. Becoming white means being seen as an individual to be judged and evaluated instead of being part of a larger group that you are collectively condemned for, right? So you are seen as an individual, not as a racial group, not as a skin color, right? You are an individual, and you have the ability to compete for jobs in all spheres instead of being confined to certain work and a segregated market, right? So by sort of lifting oneself up out of whatever forms of stigmatized poverty, immigrant ethnic neighborhood, the ability to own property, move to the suburbs, go from a blue collar to a white collar job, to own property, right? That is effectively a sign of whiteness. It is, in that case, representative of one's ability to act and be seen as citizens of the republic, right? The right to elect and to be elected, the right to be fairly tried by a jury of peers, the right to live where you could afford and where you want, the ability to spend, without racial restrictions, whatever they've earned and wherever you want to buy. So it is a certain degree of personal freedoms that have been accomplished. And so in this sense, to become white, quote unquote, at least as far as the United States is concerned, means that one ceases being ethnic. Right? One has sort of emerged out of that group. One speaks English as their primary language and adopts an American accent, as opposed to the immigrant accent that one's parents or grandparents might have had. One ceases to think just within the confines of one's ethno-political, ethno-social neighborhood and think more broadly as an American. Right? So to become white means that you are no longer an other, right? To become white means to become integrated within the, primary group of American citizenry, right? This is sort of the understanding, and this is why many immigrant groups, rather than challenging this concept of whiteness, see this as a mark of accomplishment, right? A mark of distinction, especially when one wants to, if not lose their own specific identity within this larger, broader American state, but to have their children being raised and seen as Americans, as opposed to specific ethnic identities and persuasions, right? This was kind of the whole notion of many of these European Americans coming over to the United States and then deciding, we're going to speak English. We're going to fly the American flag. We're going to effectively be what it is to be American because that means that we are accepted as one of America. So in this sense, becoming white isn't necessarily being racist, right? And this is, this is a stigma that many social scientists and commentaries want to make today, is that asserting one's whiteness has to invariably mean being racist. That's not necessarily the case, right? That is, I don't want to say that's a lie, but that's not like becoming white means one's racist. No, one does not, becoming one does not mean that one is inherently, consciously, or actively racist. Becoming white, this phenomenon that Ignatieff talks about, is primarily a method of socio-cultural and socio-political ascendancy. Right? So it's, as I've already mentioned, becoming white is a process of being accepted as members of the prevailing elite-based institutional power structure. And simultaneously, right, working to diffuse and stigmatize whatever pre-existing caricatures and stereotypes that one might have, right? So, all of the, the jokes and the caricatures and the stereotypes of the Irish in 19th century America, or the same types of caricatures and stereotypes of the Italian in late 19th, early 20th century America. These groups work to overcome these stigmas, these jokes, these images, these cartoons, right? The shifty Irish drunken, day laborer, or, the Italian organ grinder, or you're either an organ grinder or you're, working in organized crime, right? So the idea is to kind of lift yourself up from these epithets and sort of be seen as one among many others, right? The minute that you just become a John Smith, you've effectively made it. So that in of itself doesn't necessarily mean being racist, because becoming white is more often than not an effort in just trying to overcome one's own stigmas, right? So groups are not really interested in other groups, right? They're not interested in what other ethnic groups, other social groups are doing at the time. Now, they might try to differentiate themselves between one group versus themselves, but that is not always the case. Right? So in this sense, what I'm trying to say is that becoming white is more of an internal struggle, a more internal process of evolution and development. However, and I need to emphasize this, right? Racism can be present. It can very well be present when efforts at acceptance, right? When efforts at trying to be accepted by the powers that be are performed with a conscious attempt at differentiating with the other. So there is this element, right, in which an attempt at trying to show that one is American, patriotic, law-abiding, tax-paying, whatever it is that you want to do, right? It is tempting to, have members of one's own group point out that they are more patriotic, they're more law-abiding, they are, more likely to contribute to society than Group X, right? And whether it's, the blacks or the Jews or the Hispanics or the Asians or the Arabs or whoever it happens to be, right? So, becoming white can include, right, elements of racism, but this is an extra additive. This is an extra ingredient. And more often than not, right, the racism can also be directed towards one's own group. Right? So efforts by Irish and Italians to prove their Americanness, to prove their whiteness, can oftentimes target their own stereotypes. So for instance, Italian Americans throughout much of the early to mid 20th century, they're just as interested in deconstructing the stereotypes of their own people. Right, the shifty mafia, gangster, the little silly organ grinder, this, that, the other thing. Right, Italians are just as much sensitive towards differentiating themselves from other Italians, Irish from other Irish. Right, those Italians that don't want to assimilate, those that want to stay in the ethnic neighborhoods, those that continue to engage in these silly rituals and these, closed off traditional cultural practices, right? Other Italians, other Irish want to effectively, expunge themselves from that to show that they are much more part of a broader American perspective. So in this sense, being racist doesn't even have to be, I'm better than another group, but you can also engage in this type of internal comparison by saying, I'm better than, let's say, my parents' generation. I'm better than, these groups over here that are just coming over and they're still, acting slightly uncivilized, right? We have, achieved a certain degree of assimilation and evolution, and that means that we're on our way to being accepted by the, political powers that be. But again, I want to say racism can certainly be harnessed. And when we talk about racism in this sense, right, we are certainly referring to differentiating one's group from another. So especially when we examine, let's say, the Irish of the 19th century, we see that there are patterns of seeking inclusion in what is still a very exclusionary class of lawmakers, managers, leaders, power brokers, and intellectuals. So wanting to be accepted into this broader association of individuals is still a group, an association that is itself designed around racial superiority, historical exclusionary acceptance, and all other forms of, socio-political and economic hierarchy. So it's not a surprise, right, that elements of becoming white see advancement not as a way of broadening and expanding the tolerance of this group, but by being loyal little foot soldiers. So the Irish go from the immigrant to the petty bourgeois, right? The small business owner that ends up complaining just as much as their other fellow white people about taxes, about, shifty and disloyal workers, and end up supporting the very system that about a generation earlier discriminated against them. From lawbreakers to law enforcers. This is one of the, big elements here that we see, is that by the late 19th century, right? And it almost became a stereotype in itself. The Irishman goes from being, the drunken, barbarian in the streets to now being the cop on the beat, and you probably have noticed even in, old Bugs Bunny cartoons, right? All the cops have Irish accents because this was a profession that was open to them. And what better profession to show your whiteness than by becoming a member of the security apparatus. So the Irish go from lawbreakers to law enforcers, from the exploited to the American dreamer. So if you are on the, opposite end of the socioeconomic hierarchy, you will be exploited as a day laborer, as an unprotected worker in factories. The minute that you somehow are able to achieve capital, the minute that you somehow become, let's say, the petty bourgeois or the law enforcement officer, you're now on your way to achieving the American dream. And the American dream, especially by the mid-20th century, is very much individualized. So it adds to that understanding, right, that the American dream comes with the acquisition of certain material goods and the accomplishment of a number of life goals, right? Marrying, having children, buying a house, getting a car, owning property. All of this is a way of showing that I am part of the larger white American dreamer. And all of this effectively then helps transform a group of individuals that at one point were seen as dangerous deviants to American society, right? And, if you think about this, there's always one immigrant group that is sort of seen as disloyal, a threat to American unity, a group that just, doesn't seem to want to be assimilated into the larger American system, right? We have groups that we, blame now for them. The 19th century was replete with the Irish being whatever group that we blame now to be. But the minute that they somehow achieve getting into the whiteness club, they become the biggest defenders. They become the biggest patriots, right? So the Irish pub goes from being perceived as this, little peripheral roadside tavern where a bunch of shifty murderers and thieves will hang out to talk about the latest robbery, to, the Irish-American pub now that can't have enough police badges, back the blue, and American flags behind their bar, right? And every St. Patrick's Day, it's more of a display of American patriotism than anything else, right? So we go from being on the outside to being not just on the inside, but being the foot soldiers, the defenders of what it is to be on the inside. Because that is a way to constantly prove, right, that we have achieved and are active members of American whiteness. And there is something to note here, especially when we consider racism being harnessed for becoming white, is that the racism of being at the lower rungs of the dominant group. So, there's this sort of collective understanding within American political culture today, especially among whites. It's what I like to call the working class aristocracy, right? And these are, families that are still, for the most part, if they're not active working class, they still have a working class mentality. They might have a number of family members that are part of unions. And so in that case, right, they're not managerial. They still are seeing themselves as workers, as laborers, right? And so they take on this understanding that the work that I put in, the hard work, the honest work that I put in, earns the money to support my family. And that is, a collection of narratives, right, that displays accomplishment in overcoming adversity, right? This idea that one can compare oneself with, let's say, their parents or grandparents and think of, how far we've come from, the ethnic neighborhood where the grandparents spoke little to no English to me now, living in this, palatial McMansion or, one of those, small but ornate, faux stone houses with lots of statues and manicured lawns and, chrome gates in Staten Island or whatever it is, right? And so it's this sense of I've made it, right? Look at what I've had. Look at what I've been able to accomplish here. But that accomplishment is also connected to existing narratives of victimhood, in the sense that one believes, as being a member of, let's say, the lower spheres of whiteness, that nobody gave them anything. Nobody gave them handouts. Nobody gave them affirmative action. Nobody gave them political correctness, right? You've had to fight for it. You had to struggle for it. You had to earn it. And you've had to defend it. And these narratives, especially if they are shared among like-minded members, and, we've seen this. We've seen this in, let's say, the past year or so, definitely within the era of Donald Trump, that certain whites, especially I've seen this online, where Irish Americans today, and when we talk about Irish Americans, we're talking about third, fourth generation here. We're not talking right off the boat, but this idea that their ancestors came here as indentured servants, right? They were slaves just as much as the blacks were slaves in the South, but nobody fought for them. There was no abolition movement for them. Nobody cared about them. So they kind of see themselves as like the unsung victims. And they kind of emancipated themselves without any kind of, outside help, which also leads towards, some understanding of this all lives mattering narrative, right? So we talked last week about the importance of Black Lives Matter, not just as a movement, but as a statement, as a slogan. And we know that within a short period of time, there was this reactionary response, largely coming from white America, that all lives matter, right? Which it doesn't take long for all lives matter to kind of take on a very white exclusionary, type of understanding here. But this understanding that if you say all lives matter, you tend to sort of come from that working class white community where you believe, right? You fervently believe that everything that you've accomplished and made in life is through your own work and your own investment, right? Nobody gave you any particular handout. So the narrative goes, why should other groups be, sort of seen as different, as victims, as the downtrodden, as any more, right? It's sort of like, I got mine, I did my own thing, why can't you do that, right? And these narratives, which again aren't necessarily racist deliberately, certainly have that racist overtones, especially when these narratives conflict, right? Especially when the narrative of, the Irish indentured servant of the 19th century is equated on the same level as that of the slave, which is very, very problematic because at the end of the day, right, the Irish indentured servant might have been exploited, might have been at the lowest rung of society above that of Black and Native American, but they were still somehow, they were still free as individuals, whereas Black slaves were considered property, right? And that's something that is conveniently missing in this, narrative of Irish or white victimhood. So, as I said, becoming white doesn't necessarily mean being racist, but racism can certainly be harnessed, especially when one is trying to elevate their own group to be accepted. And in a way, in doing so, people will differentiate and people will try to find how their group has accomplished more or done more or provided a greater sense of loyalty to the country than others. And that's where racism can kind of exist and come in by default. Right? So, here we need to look, right, at the case of the Irish American, because this is really the focus of the book and one of the most studied cases of how a group in the United States, quote unquote, became white, right? We need to remember that when Irish first came here in droves, they were like the real first mass immigrant community to come to the United States. I mean, the existing socio-political elites at the time were warning that the country is done for, right? That there's this mass horde of uneducated, non-Protestant, poor working class day laborers are just coming drove after drove into the United States and effectively just undermining the social fabric of what the country already was. So the first obstacle that the Irish as a group has to overcome is this understanding of American nativism, right? Which is something that I guess we could call proto-white supremacy. But it was a type of white supremacy that was exclusionary even among whites. Nativism is really a type of, I don't even want to say modern day racism. It's just sort of a form of paleo-political conservatism that sought to preserve as much as possible the existing oligarchic status quo of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant families that had traced their lineage back from the Revolutionary period up to the then present point. Right, so it's less of a white supremacist as it is an aristocratic economic elitist movement. And so that's why Irish and then, afterwards Italians were seen as social inferiors, political oppositionists, religious deviants, and of course, economic rabble. So we're not talking about people that come in small amounts, here and there with some skill to their profession. They're not Protestant, which is also a big threat, right? The concept of Catholicism was seen, at the time, in the same way that, let's say, Islam or socialism, communism is sort of seen today among many American conservatives. So for decades, right, the Irish were, sort of relegated to the poorest slums of, inner cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore being some examples. So the Irish quickly end up becoming this fifth column element within the North. They are not accepted by the socio-political status quo. They're seen as disloyal, problematic, crime-ridden. They're not Protestant. Some of them don't even speak proper English. What to do? What to do with them? And what becomes sort of a political strategy among the Democratic Party. And, again, we need to note, right, the Democratic Party at the time was the party of the slaveholder, right? The party of the agrarian, commercial agrarian interests. Remember, this is pre-Civil War America. The Democratic Party comes up with an ingenious strategy of harnessing the Irish vote as a way of solidifying some kind of national unity between slaveholding interests in the South and enough votes among the downtrodden and the oppressed in the North. This is the strategy that became part of the Democratic Party around the time of not just Andrew Jackson, but specifically Martin Van Buren. It was a way of fusing national unity with a broader concept of white supremacy. And it was primarily done as a way of breaking the political domination of nativism, which had been held by the then rival Whig Party. So it's a way of overcoming a different type of exclusionary culture, but in a way gaining the loyalty of a group of people that know they're being oppressed, know they're on the peripheral elements of political and economic society, and in return getting their gratitude, their loyalty, and their votes. This, initially is a way of maintaining a certain sense of electoral national unity to blunt and limit the effects of abolitionism. What's interesting is that Northern abolitionism kind of straddles both, political groups here. You have one that definitely is more the humanitarian, the Christian, the inclusive, the early concept of, let's say, the socialist, right? Blacks and whites are all the same people. This is more of the humanistic approach to abolitionism. But then you also have an interesting combination of abolitionists in the North that simply want to undermine and weaken the South from an economic standpoint, right? An increasing industrialization of the North leads to efforts at undermining the commercial monopoly that the American South has through the plantation network. And so with the idea of abolition, right, the entire agricultural unit is undone, and the freeing of slaves means that there is now a new surplus of labor that could be used, abused, and exploited. This, of course, is seen by many members of the Irish community as the biggest threat, because if they are effectively segregated, oppressed, and left out of jobs and opportunities, then more free blacks, more than the ones that already live in the North, are going to be even bigger competitors. Because in many cases, the black was seen as someone who would be taking even less money than the Irish would. So the Irish are effectively kind of co-opted into the Democratic Party, which is the party of maintaining, right, this balance between slave states and free states. And, as such, we harness racism as a price for white inclusion. So it is this sort of paradoxical, almost illogical coalition of Southern slaveholders and Northern laborers, right? So you would think, right, that Northern laborers would identify with their fellow exploited workers in the South, right, the slaves. Instead, the Southern slaveholders, right, the ones that keep this feudal hierarchy going in the United States, reach out to Northern laborers not because they actually care about their plight in the factories, although they can use that, as a political weapon. But it's just a group of people that had previously been, discarded, ignored, and left off the political grid by the American nativists. So feudal aristocracy pointing out the exploited labor of Northern industrialism can only make sense when one is simply trying to gain the electoral support of the Irish. And as far as the Irish are concerned, slaves, that's down there, right? That's down there. That's not their problem. They've got their own immediate problems to worry about. They're worrying about discrimination, harassment, economic exploitation, all sorts of problems that they deal with on a day-to-day basis, right? Slavery, whatever it happens to be, not their problem, not their thing. If this party, which happens to be upholding the concept of slavery, is reaching out to them through local patronage networks and helping them to advance up the socioeconomic and socio-political ladder in what is effectively competitor states, well then so be it, who cares? So by rejecting the nativism of the North, right, the Democratic Party offered an opportunity for the Irish to enter the ranks of white politics. This is ultimately what plays out. The Democratic Party gives the Irish the first opportunity to not only enter politics, but to be recognized by politics. And if that means that entering politics means that they have an opportunity of now being seen as equal members of the white group, well, then it doesn't matter whether it's the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the Whig Party, the Communist Party, whatever it happens to be. It is a way of alleviating them from what was then, right, noted systemic racism, xenophobia, and exclusion. And probably a better way of understanding this, and this is something that was only briefly mentioned by Ignatieff, but it's worth pointing out here, is that it's less the Democratic Party elite and more the Democratic Party machine represented through Tammany Hall. Right? Tammany Hall, especially within New York City, but Tammany also has its subsidiary branches in Boston, Philadelphia, and others. Right? The Democratic Party machine was ingenious in getting voter patronage, getting loyal votes in return for clientelism, favors, all sorts of things, right? The Democratic Party, through Tammany, offers the Irish the first opportunity at some form of political representation. And they do so, so simplistically, it's not even funny. By simply saying, vote for my candidate, we in turn will give you certain things, right? We will alleviate certain problems in your workplace. We will, raise your wages, give you this, right? It's a tit-for-tat basis here. This is how you explain politics to the uninitiated. So patronage and clientelism is seen by, okay, I vote for them, they give me this, I'm somehow now increasing my participation and inclusion within American society. It is also the party that allows the Irish to enter into local politics and run on, local tickets. The nativist parties wanted absolutely nothing to do with the Irish at all, right? They wanted to keep them off the voting records as much as possible. Tammany gives Irishmen the opportunity of becoming aldermans. Now, I know that this might be a term that most people don't know. It's still around today. An alderman is kind of like it's a political official just below that of mayor, right? So if the mayor is someone that sort of handles the overall day-to-day operations of the city, the alderman is the one that is in the streets working directly with people, with businesses, with interests. This is, this is considered to be clear opportunities for the Irish. Why? Because it builds on connections. It relies on networks. And if these connections and networks also rely on, patronage, clientelism, nepotism, then it means that the first group of Irish that get into politics are going to help out their fellow Irishmen. So it's seen as a victory for the neighborhood, for the community, right? And so, interestingly enough, the Irish become some of the most loyal members of a party that, as far as the North is concerned, speaks on behalf of the industrially exploited, but country overall is in favor of maintaining the institution of slavery. Again, for the Irish, if they knew about it, it didn't concern them on a day-to-day basis. Because of the understanding and the narrative that comes out, the Irish suffer as much, and sometimes, if not even more, than the black. Now, this is a very problematic narrative to make, but again, narratives which form group identity aren't really interested in the plight of others if said narrative advances their own socioeconomic station. But we see how these narratives, certainly can be self-serving, because if it points out the paltry, the horrible conditions that exploited workers like the Irish suffer in industrial sectors, right? That's not untrue, right? It's not untrue at all. Again, the Irish is still a free person. They're not, personal property. But the narrative that goes into this is that the Irish are overlooked by the abolitionists, right? Here you've got abolitionists in the North that are talking about slavery in the South. But when someone asks them, well, what do we do about the factory worker? What do we do about the Irish? They seem to just kind of draw a blank in their face and say, well, my job is to talk about black bondage. Well, what about the Irish? What about our own problems? And if we're getting our support from the party that you abolitionists are criticizing, well, then the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And you see how this patronage, you see how this loyalty begins, especially if the Democratic Party is offering them a roadmap into the gradual whiteification, the gradual inclusion within American society. So this, adds to our understanding of how one completes, right, the road to whiteness. How does one become white when we think of political culture, when we think of socio-political strategies? The Democratic Party worked to transform the Irish into effectively the new face of the exploited working class in the American post-Civil War. So once slavery was, done away with, right, now the Irish can be seen as, the new poster child for, the problems, the elitism, the inequality, the injustice of the American North. And of course, this is going to be used whenever criticisms and problems will be noted about the continued segregation and racism in the American South. But here's sort of the unfortunate reality of American history. And we oftentimes just tend to think, Civil War, Reconstruction, everything works, right? No, it really doesn't. Reconstruction is kind of aborted early on. And concepts of national unity, which oftentimes imply white unity, give way towards overlooking the problems and the racism and the segregation of the blacks, insofar as we now can integrate the Irish into part of the American political society, and they'll thank us, right, every step of the way. We can turn them from potential deviants and dangerous elements to this country into the biggest defenders of this national white unity. And so what ends up happening is that American nativism isn't necessarily dismantled. It's just expanded, right? Nativism is now expanded more so to be more inclusive of white supremacy. So in this sense, the Irish became white without changing really what it meant to be white at the time, which was a sociocultural and socio-political form of superiority over different people, different ethnic groups, different socioeconomic groups within the country. So, in other words, by working to be accepted into the system, the Irish end up becoming the biggest defenders of that system, right? Now, as a way of proving their authenticity, of proving their sense of worth. And of course, mobilized as they are by narratives of we were discriminated against, we overcame that. There was no war that had to be fought. There was no emancipation. There was no abolitionists. We did it all on our own. This is sort of followed later on by other would-be white communities. The Italians did this in the 1920s and 30s. A large chunk of Poles, but I should also add Eastern Europeans, but there's a large, number of Polish Americans, particularly just before, the onset of the Cold War, and then, of course, now in the 1990s, right? You'll get, Eastern Europeans that come to the United States, and as a way of showing their American authenticity, they'll be the biggest opponents of anything even remotely considered socialist, right? Because they'll link that to communism back in the old Cold War period. They'll, purport the narratives that everybody was, standing on bread lines and food was scarce and starvation. It was a Orwellian experience, even though that never really happened. But they'll do that as a way of trying to show their patriotic fervor for the American way of life. And we increasingly see this also within elements of the Latin American community. It's not as pronounced right now, and I can't say that, it's one particular group over the other, let's say Cubans versus Mexicans versus Dominicans, right? But there is this understanding, especially when whiteness is attached to some form of individualistic consumerism, right? That achieving a certain series of benchmarks in life, right? Getting a good paying job, owning property, moving to the suburbs, and no longer really caring about the plight of others, but just kind of caring more about self-improvement, is a form of whiteness, right? And we see this even among some, Latino politicians like Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, who are some of the biggest defenders of the inequalities of the Republican Party. But yet they will kind of toot their own horn by being the foot soldiers of this world of Ronald Reagan, right? And members of their own community that think otherwise are seen to still be ethnic, right? They still haven't evolved yet. They haven't assimilated into American culture. And maybe they'll get it. Maybe their children will get it, right? But it still takes time for them to think like a white, as opposed to thinking within their little immigrant barrios, right? So it's not just the Irish that have done this, right? The process of becoming white is, in a way, sort of altering one's cultural attitudes and beliefs to become part of what was once closed off to you. But once you are part of that, you are on that wall every day, making certain that unwanted and unqualified people don't get in to your gated community. So this leaves us, right, with some lingering questions, right? Because, the narrative of becoming white seems quite paradoxical, especially when it's directed at groups that are really at the lower levels of socioeconomic mobility and opportunity. The first one is, why didn't the Irish include the black as an exploited companion? Like you would think that at some point there would be some socio-political movements among the Irish that would look at their own plight and the plight of, if not the enslaved black, certainly the free black, and ask, hey, we're both kind of discriminated and marginalized by a group of aristocratic wasps, right? What gives? Shouldn't there be some kind of, collective opposition, some movement that could unite us and, really, really challenge the system? A couple of hypotheses explain why this wasn't the case. First of all, and probably most likely, the Democratic Party got to the Irish before the Irish created any real solidarity with the black. And if the Democratic Party, especially Tammany Hall, immediately engages in this type of tit-for-tat patronage network that buys their loyalty and secures their everlasting, commitment to being part of a system, then that aggrieved group is going to leave the other one behind. I mean, that's just kind of how, groups collectively will think. There might be individuals that feel sympathetic, but as a group, they're going to use this opportunity to get ahead. The second hypothesis is that ideas of class consciousness, that type of stuff that, we talk about in Marxist theory, never really, engaged itself, never really, became a movement in the United States that early. I mean, we are talking about really 1830s, 1840s. I mean, this stuff doesn't really come into play until really the Industrial Revolution. So we're talking 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. Make no mistake about it, right? The American labor movement by the turn of the 20th century was some of the most active and violent that you'll ever find. I mean, people tend to forget, about a century ago, the United States was seen as one of the most likely countries to be part of the socialist vanguard until the labor movement was, defanged and ultimately, just deconstructed throughout the mid to late 20th century. But this is something that didn't happen when the Irish were the exploited group. So for them, all politics is local. Democratic Party reaches them, offers them opportunities for advancement, and this is in an era of racism, discrimination, nativism against the Irish. For them, this is their exit, right? This is their exit strategy. This is for them a way to advance within their environment. Number two, the Irish were largely dwellers in the industrial sectors, the city sectors, right? There was not a lot of agricultural Irish, many of whom could not afford to start farms, to buy land, right? They came with no money, so you end up living in the urban slums. Many of them who came from, English-occupied Ireland were tenant farmers themselves. So they were already exploited. They had no land to begin with. So they had no, let's say, agricultural wherewithal. So coming to the United States and just kind of staying within these city neighborhoods of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and others, they remain really an industrial sector class. And in that sense, what jobs and opportunities were available to them were few and far between, but what was known is that they were forced to compete at the lower levels of economic opportunity with the other exploited and downtrodden, and those were almost exclusively the free black. So if that already created a competition for who was going to fight over what table scraps were thrown onto the floor, the idea of eventual emancipation of the slave meant for them an explosion of a population of free blacks who would, the narratives went, immediately leave the South and gravitate towards the North. So we now have this army of migrants that are, finish the sentence for me, poised to come here and take your job, right? The fear of the migrant free black worker is going to, force the Irish to support a political system that keeps them on the land and keeps them down there, right? It's, slavery is that wall that they want to keep and fortify and expand in order to safeguard whatever scraps of opportunities and jobs that they have. In the meantime, the Democratic Party is more than happy to tell them all of this while giving them, the first tastes of advancement through political patronage and clientelism. This leads us to a second question, a broader question here. The Irish are not alone in this process of becoming white. So what parallels can we find in this assimilation that we can look at in later immigrant cases? A few weeks ago, we talked about the Italian-American groups wanting to rehabilitate and reinvent the history of Christopher Columbus. Prior to the early 20th century, right? No one really knew about him, and now today everybody's removing statues of him because he's a racist, whatever. But why? Is there a reason why the Italians chose Christopher Columbus as opposed to Giuseppe Garibaldi or Giovanni da Verrazzano? Again, one hypothesis is as a way of trying to prove their whiteness, their authenticity to a system that discriminates against them, but they want to be a part of. Perhaps the choice of Christopher Columbus, right? Perhaps choosing Christopher Columbus really does two things. Number one, it shows that Christopher Columbus was the first explorer of some broad kind to make it to the New World. Giovanni da Verrazzano was fine, but he's local. And, he's largely someone who just kind of discovered what would eventually become New York. And that distinct honor was really given to Henry Hudson. So Italians are not really interested in replacing Henry Hudson, good English wasp that he was, with Verrazzano. But Columbus is the first, which means that he predates everyone else. And perhaps, the history of Columbus, which could not have been, hidden from people, but, the policies that he, supported as a way of subjugating the indigenous populations might have been considered as a way of proving to a system that Italians wanted to be a part of, that Italians, just like other white Americans, are interested in law, order, stability, control, for eventual progress and development, right? It's one hypothesis. And, did it work? Largely, Italians are now seen as part of the larger fabric of whiteness. Yes, they still have their, individual culture, just like the Irish do, but that culture is now considered to be part of American culture, not specifically Italian culture, right? So by whiteifying their ethnicity, and, I have to add, these are largely Southern Italians that are taking someone that was from Northern Italy separated by about 4 centuries, but making him, right, an Italian American patriot is a way of trying to prove one's authenticity to get into the community of white Americans. And so, a third question, and one that we can, sort of bat around in class on Wednesday, and of course we can do so in the comment sections here as well, is why are collective memories of victimhood and hardship insular to each group and not inclusive of others? So whether it's the Irish, the Italians, the Eastern European that is quote unquote escaped communism and made it to the United States, right? Whatever it happens to be, right? The Cuban, why are these collective memories of victimhood always, always, always focused on their own group, their own hardship? Why don't these groups, recognize at some point that hardship, discrimination, harassment, racism, victimhood tends to be perennial in a country that seems to make this part of its own history, right? If not the Irish, it's the Italians. If not the Italians, it's the Puerto Ricans. If it's not the Puerto Ricans, it's the Dominicans. If it's not the Dominicans, it's the Asians. If it's not the Asians, it's the Pakistanis. If it's not the, you get the idea, right? And even before the Irish, again, this is, before history really started being recorded, as much as possible here, right? But, who were another groups that were discriminated against? Germans and Jews as well. And all of them, in a way, tried to not so much challenge the system of nativist racism as to prove, no, I'm part of you guys. Continue to be exclusionary, but include me in that exclusionary process. So why are these narratives always ethnic instead of class-based? How is it that only for a brief moment in, let's say, the first decade or so of the 20th century did these narratives of victimhood take on more of a class-conscious undertone, right? Very Marxist, very labor-intensive, but quickly be, fragmented again in the post-war era of the 40s and 50s into victimization by race, victimization by ethnic group. And who is trying to compete with each other over who had the most difficult time trying to make it in America before they finally became, one of those, self-made, six-figure earning, Republican votings, dwellers of Staten Island or whatever it is, right? How did this really happen? Because in a way, in order to become part of American society, you feel like you have to embrace a lot of the lesser attributable vices of American political culture. So I will leave these questions, sort of open for discussion. I welcome comments here in the comment section. I also look forward to a discussion within class on Wednesday. I may have provided some hypothetical answers for some of them, but I'm interested in seeing what you get out of this. So that brings this lecture to a close. I hope that you found the material interesting, if not somewhat depressing, but it adds to our understanding of the importance of cultural identity and how that translates into ethnic politics in the United States.